The Wild West didn't die with its boots on. It didn't end in a cinematic blaze of glory under a high noon sun. It died in the wet cough of a tuberculosis ward. It died in the shadow of a New York skyscraper. It died in a Denver basement, buried under 20 tons of concrete. And it died in a Mexican alleyway where a man's head was traded for a bottle of tequila. It didn't end at the OK Corral. It ended in a Hollywood bungalow, at the tip of a newspaperman's pen and face down in the mud, betrayed for a handful of silver. Tonight we pull back the curtain on the myth. From the icons you know to the shadows you've forgotten. These are 100-plus legends of the Old West and the real stories of how they met their end. Hunter 2. John Wesley Powell, the one-armed survivor. He mapped the last unknown veins of the American West with only one arm. A Civil War veteran turned explorer, Powell stared into the abyss of the Colorado River and lived to tell the story. But the frontier didn't kill him. There was no ambush, no bullet, no betrayal. He died quietly in 1902, in a bed, surrounded by papers and maps, a man who had conquered the wild, only to be erased by time itself. 101. Big. Steve Long, the six-shooter judge. In the lawless town of Laramie, Wyoming, Steve Long didn't just wear a badge. He used it to build a graveyard. As the town's marshal, he had a shoot first, ask never policy, killing over a dozen men in a single year, often just to seize their property. He was a predator hiding behind a tin star, operating a saloon that doubled as a death trap. In 1868, the townspeople finally had enough of his justice. A massive lynch mob dragged Long and his two brothers to an unfinished cabin. They didn't wait for a trial or a formal gallows. They strung all three brothers up from a single construction beam and left them to hang in the freezing Wyoming wind. It was a brutal reminder that in the Old West, the only thing more dangerous than an outlaw was a lawman who thought he was a king. 100. Heck Thomas, the Guardian's Heart. One of the 3 guardsmen who brought hell to the Oklahoma territories. After surviving over 100 shootouts and capturing the most dangerous men in the West, Thomas didn't fall to a bullet. In 1912, as the first Ford Model Ts began rattling down the streets he once cleared of outlaws, his heart simply gave out. He died of Bright's disease, a quiet internal collapse for a man who had survived a lifetime of external violence. 99. Bill Tilghman Jr., the modern tragedy. The son of the legendary Marshal Bill Tilghman. While his father was a relic of the Black Powder era, the younger Bill met a distinctly modern end. In 1916, he wasn't thrown from a horse or ambushed in a saloon. He died in a car accident. It was a jarring, mechanical death that signaled the frontier was truly gone, replaced by steel, rubber, and speed. 98. Chris Madsen, the last guardsman. The third of Oklahoma's legendary trio. Madsen outlived the frontier by half a century, dying in 1944 at the age of 93. A man who had fought Vikings in the Danish army and outlaws in the American West spent his final years watching newsreels of World War II. He died in a world of tanks and airplanes, the last living link to a time when justice was settled with a single-action Colt. 97. Harry Wheeler, the Ranger's Regret. The last of the great Arizona Rangers. Wheeler was a man of iron discipline who saw the West change from a land of mystery to a land of paperwork. He died of pneumonia in 1925, reportedly frustrated that the Wild West had been smothered by bureaucrats, tax collectors, and the very civilization he had fought to protect. 96. Charlie Siringo, the Hollywood consultant, the cowboy detective who spent decades chasing the Wild Bunch for the Pinkertons. He died in 1928 in Los Angeles, spending his final days as an advisor to silent film stars. He watched in silence as actors who couldn't even sit a horse properly tried to recreate the life he'd actually bled for. He died as a technical advisor to his own history. 95. Blackjack Christian, the Shattered Outlaw. The first blackjack of the High Border Gang. In 1897, a posse caught him in a canyon in Arizona. There was no trial. The posse's shotguns tore him apart at close range, mangling his body so badly that they didn't even bother to transport him. They buried him in an unmarked hole in the canyon floor, leaving him to be reclaimed by the desert he had terrorized. 94. Blue Duck, the Slow Rot. The outlaw lover of Belle Starr, famous for his stoic violence. He didn't die in a blaze of glory. He died of tuberculosis in 1895. Paroled from prison because he was too sick to be dangerous, he spent his final days gasping for air in a world that had already forgotten his name. He was a prisoner of his own lungs before he was a prisoner of the law. 93. El Fuego Baca, the man who couldn't be killed. They fired over 4,000 rounds into a shack the size of a coffin. 80 men tried to erase El Fuego Baca from existence. When the smoke cleared, he walked out without a scratch. But the West didn't take him with bullets. It let him live. He died decades later, peacefully. In 1945, a man who proved the most terrifying thing in the Wild West wasn't death. It was survival. 92. Grattan Dalton, the first escape. Long before the Coffeyville massacre, Grat survived a train wreck that killed dozens. He walked away from the twisted iron and steam, convinced he was invincible. That belief lasted only months. He survived the machine only to be cut down by the neighbors he grew up with, choking on his own blood in a Kansas alleyway. 91. Little Dick West, the barn ambush. The last member of the Doolin-Dalton gang to be hunted down. In 1898, lawmen cornered him in a dark barn in Guthrie, Oklahoma. He refused to surrender, firing into the dark until a hail of return fire riddled him so many times he was nearly unrecognizable. He died in the hay, the final bloody punctuation mark on the Dalton legacy. 90. Poker Alice, the botched bet. The most famous female gambler in the West, a woman who smoked cigars and carried a .38. She survived the gold rushes, the brawls, and the boomtowns, only to die in 1930. The Queen of Gamblers lost her final bet on an operating table following a botched gallbladder surgery, a domestic end for a woman who lived for the high stakes. 89. Cattle. Annie, the Long Silence. A teenage outlaw who rode with the Doolin gang. She didn't die in a shootout. She went straight, married a farmer, and became a quiet grandmother. She lived until 1978, the last living link to the Wild Bunch era. She died in a world of color television and space travel, carrying the secrets of the 1890s into a suburban grave. 88. Little Britches, the Disappearing Act. Annie's partner in crime. After their capture, she was sent to a reform school in the East and vanished. No criminal record followed her. She died in obscurity. Her outlaw passed a secret she never told her neighbors, proving that sometimes the best way to survive the West was to pretend it never happened. 87. Etta Place, the Vanishing Rose. The mysterious woman who rode with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. After the shootout in Bolivia, she simply disappeared from the map. No death certificate, no grave, no witnesses. She remains the frontier's ultimate disappearing act, a ghost who walked out of the legend and never looked back. 86. Big Nose Kate, the Last Witness. Doc Holliday's longtime companion and the only person who truly knew the man behind the deadly dentist myth. She died in 1940 at the age of 89 in a pioneer home. She outlived Doc by over 50 years, spending her final days watching Hollywood turn her life into a series of lies. 85. John Allison, the Shadow Brother. The younger brother of the crazy, Clay Allison. While his brother became a legend for his violence and drunken stunts, John chose a different path. He died quietly on a ranch, a nobody who proved that the Allison bloodline didn't always end in a tragedy. 84. Turkey Creek, Jack Johnson, the Failing Lungs. A hero of Wyatt Earp's vendetta ride. He was a man who hunted murderers through the Arizona brush without flinching, but he couldn't fight the consumption. He died of tuberculosis in a Salt Lake City hospital in 1887, his lungs failing him where the cowboys' bullets couldn't. 83. Texas, Jack Vermillion, the Peaceful Sleeper. Another Earp ally known for his cool head under fire. He survived the blood-soaked year of 1882 only to die in his sleep in 1911. It was a peaceful, quiet end for a man who had spent his youth hunting the most dangerous men in the West through the high desert. 82. Sherman McMaster, the Soldier's Grave. The Earp ally is rumored to be a traitor or a spy. He allegedly left the West behind to fight in the Spanish-American War in 1898. He was a 19th century cowboy who met a 20th century death on a foreign battlefield, his bones buried far from the Arizona dust. 81. Buckshot Roberts, the Two-Day Death. The The man who fought the entire Billy the Kid gang single-handedly at Blazer's Mill. He was shot in the belly during the fight but refused to give up, barricading himself in a shack. He took 2 agonizing days to bleed out in total isolation, a gritty, lonely end for the man who stood his ground against the West's most famous outlaws. 80. John Joshua Webb, the smallpox cell, a lawman turned killer. He was once a respected figure at Dodge City, but he died in 1882 while on the run. He didn't die in a shootout. He died of smallpox in a lonely hospital ward. It was considered a shameful death for a man of the gun, taken down by a microscopic killer rather than a lead bullet. 79. Henry Brown, the lynched marshal, a former regulator with Billy the Kid who reinvented himself as a hero marshal in Kansas. He was given a gold-plated rifle by the townspeople for his service, but the outlaw life called him back. When he was caught robbing a bank in a nearby town, his own citizens turned into a mob and lynched him. He died on the end of a rope, his gold rifle a mocking reminder of his failed redemption. 78. Bass Reeves, the law that outlived the West. He hunted over 3,000 outlaws across a land where most men wouldn't last a week. Bass Reeves was the law unbreakable, unstoppable, and nearly mythical. Bandits feared him. Killers ran from him. But in the end, there was no final showdown, no last ride. Just a slow, quiet failure of the body he had pushed beyond human limits. He died in 1910, not in a gunfight, but in silence. The last victory belongs not to a man, but to time itself. 77. Lonnie Logan, the Brothers Fall, the brother of the psychopathic Kid Curry. In 1900, a posse tracked him to his aunt's house in Missouri. He tried to run through the snow but was gunned down in the yard. His death served as the fuel for Kid Curry's final murderous rampage against the law. 76. Bob Lee, the Broken Spirit, the partner of Flat Nose, George Curry. While George was killed in the dirt, Bob was captured and sent to prison. He died behind bars, his spirit broken by 4 walls after a lifetime of riding through the wide-open spaces of the hole in the wall. 75. Laughing, Sam Carey, the Mountain Skeleton, a minor outlaw who vanished into the mountains to escape a posse. He was never seen alive again. Years later, a hunter found a skeleton leaning against a tree, a rusted revolver still clutched in its hand. He didn't die in a fight, he died of exposure, laughing at the world that could never catch him. 74. The Sundance Kid's father, the unknown parent. He died in the East while his son was becoming the most famous fugitive in the world. He went to his grave never knowing that his boy would die in a Bolivian shootout, his family name forever linked to the most famous heist in history. 73. Joshua Bean, the Bitter Spark, the brother of the famous hanging judge, Roy Bean. He was assassinated in 1852 in a California ambush. His death turned Roy Bean from a simple trader into a bitter, eccentric judge who ruled his courtroom with a law book and a loaded revolver. 72. Catherine Antrim, the Mother's Grave. She was the anchor for a boy the world would eventually call a monster. Catherine Antrim was an Irish immigrant who moved her 2 sons across a brutal landscape, seeking a clean start in the dry air of Silver City, New Mexico. But the frontier didn't offer a cure, it offered a sentence. In 1874, the consumption, tuberculosis, finally withered her away. Her death didn't just leave 15-year-old Henry McCarty an orphan, it severed his last tie to a normal life of school books and chores. With no father to guide him and his stepfather quickly abandoning the boys, Henry was cast into the streets of a mining town where survival required a different set of skills. He went from a grieving son to a petty thief, and eventually to the most wanted man in the territory. Catherine died in a humble bed, never knowing that her death was the silent catalyst that sent her boy toward the Lincoln County War and into the blood-soaked pages of the history books. 71. Jesse Wayne Brazel, the man who killed a giant. The man who officially killed Pat Garrett. He was a small-time rancher who claimed he shot Garrett in self-defense. He was acquitted by a jury that didn't much like Garrett anyway. Brazel lived a long, unremarkable life and died a nobody, the man who extinguished the life of the man who killed the kid. 70. The Apache Kid, the unsolved mystery. Once a prize scout for the U.S. Army, A series of blood feuds and a flash of frontier temper turned him into the most hunted man in the Southwest. In 1889, he escaped a transport to prison and vanished into the Sierra Madre Mountains. No body was ever found, and no bounty was ever collected. For 40 years, whenever a ranch was raided or a shadow moved in the brush, the locals whispered his name. He didn't just escape the law, he escaped time itself, becoming a ghost that outlived the Wild West. 69. Laura Bullion, the Rose of the Wild Bunch. She was the Thorny Rose, a woman who lived in a world of men who solved problems with lead. She laundered the stolen banknotes for Butch Cassidy's gang and stayed loyal through prison and exile. While the rest of the gang died in hail of bullet shootouts, Laura lived to see the age of the television and the nuclear bomb. She died quietly in Memphis in 1961, an 84-year-old woman selling knickknacks, carrying the secrets of the Wild Bunch into a grave marked with a name no one recognized. 68. Ben Kilpatrick, the Tall Texan. Ben Kilpatrick was a man who refused to believe the frontier was closed. By 1912, in an era of electric lights, telephones, and early automobiles, the Tall Texan was still living in a world of saddlebags and black powder. He attempted to rob a Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio train near Sanderson, Texas, using the same 19th century tactics that had worked for Butch Cassidy a decade earlier. But the world has grown colder and more efficient. Kilpatrick didn't meet his end at the hands of a legendary lawman in a storied shootout. Instead, he faced a civilian express messenger named David Trousdale, a man who didn't even have a gun. As Kilpatrick leaned over to loot a safe, Trousdale grabbed the only weapon within reach, a heavy wooden ice mallet used for the train's refrigeration. With a single, desperate strike, he crushed Kilpatrick's skull, killing the outlaw instantly. Trousdale then picked up the dead man's own rifle to finish off his partner. It was a brutal, unceremonious end for a man who had become a relic of the past before he even stepped onto the tracks. 67. Harvey Logan, Kid Curry, the Suicide. The most violent member of the Wild Bunch, with at least 9 notches on his gun and a hatred for the law that bordered on psychopathic. In 1904, after a train robbery in Colorado, he was wounded and cornered by a posse in a rocky gulch. Realizing the invincible Kid Curry was finally trapped, he chose his own exit. He put a bullet in his brain rather than give the law the satisfaction of a trial. He was so feared that the Pinkertons eventually exhumed his body just to verify the devil was actually gone. 66. George Flatnose Curry, the Rustler's End. He was the veteran mentor of the Hole in the Wall, the man who practically raised the Wild Bunch and taught Butch Cassidy how to vanish into the Red Rock. But in 1900, the world George Flatnose Curry had mastered was closing its borders. While rustling cattle along the Grand River in Utah, the legendary outlaw was caught in the crosshairs of a hidden posse. There was no cinematic standoff and no defiant last words. He was dropped by a single clinical rifle shot from a distance that tore through his skull before he even heard the report. George fell face first into the dry Utah dirt, dying among the very cows he was trying to steal. The lawmen didn't even bother to bring him in for a proper burial. They left his body in the canyon for the vultures and the elements. It was a cold, quiet end for the man who had mentored the West's most famous gang, proving that in the end, the frontier doesn't care about your reputation. It only cares about who sees who first. 65. John Selman, the Backshooter's Fate. Selman gained immortality in 1895 by walking up behind the deadliest man in Texas, John Wesley Hardin, and shooting him in the back of the head. But in El Paso, fame was just a bullseye. Only a year later, Selman got into a dispute over a card game with a U.S. Marshal named George Scarborough. They stepped into a dark alley, but Selman didn't get to fire first this time. He was riddled with bullets and died in the same dust where he had killed Hardin. In the West, violence didn't end, and sooner or later, it came back for you. 64. Curly Bill Brocious, the Miracle or the Myth. The leader of the Arizona Cowboys and the man Wyatt Earp hated most. During the Vendetta ride, Earp claimed he caught Curly Bill at Iron Springs and nearly cut him in half with a shotgun blast. Yet no body was ever found. The cowboys claimed Earp missed, and rumors persisted for decades that Curly Bill had slipped across the border to Mexico, changed his name, and lived to a ripe old age, dying in a warm bed while the world debated if Earp was a hero or a liar. No grave or no proof, just a story that refuses to die. 63. Frank McLaury, the fatal flaw, the brave McLaury brother. At the OK Corral, Frank was the only one who seemed ready for the violence. Even after being shot in the belly, he led his horse into the street to use as a shield. As he took steady aim at Morgan Earp for a killing shot, a bullet from Wyatt hit him behind the ear. He was dead before his knees hit the gravel, his dream of a ranching empire ending in 30 seconds of chaos. 62. Tom McLaury, the shotgun blast. History still debates if Tom McLaury was even holding a gun when the firing started in that narrow tombstone alleyway. While the Earps and the cowboys traded lead, Tom was caught in the open, trapped between a crossfire and a spooked horse. As he desperately grabbed for the animal's reins to use it as a shield, Doc Holliday stepped forward with a 10-gauge double-barrel shotgun. The blast was so close it nearly tore Tom's torso in two, shredding through his wool coat and his ribs in a single, devastating spray of buckshot. He didn't die instantly. He stumbled out of the alley like a ghost, clutching his side as he collapsed onto the wooden sidewalk outside Fly's photography gallery. He took his last breath in the shadow of the very studio that would soon develop the photos of his corpse, turning his violent, messy end into a profitable piece of frontier folklore. 61. Billy Clanton, the final cartridge. Billy was only 19 years old, the kid of the cowboy faction who was caught in a war he wasn't ready for. At the OK Corral, the transition from boy to corpse took less than 30 seconds. Within the first heartbeats of the gunfight, he was hit in the chest and the wrist, the impact slamming him backward into the gravel. But while the older men ran or fell, Billy refused to stay down. As he lay dying in the dust, blinded by the black powder smoke, he used his one functional hand to desperately claw at his revolver, trying to cock the hammer against his thigh. He didn't scream for a doctor. He begged the panicked onlookers for more cartridges so he could keep his thumb on the trigger. He eventually crawled toward a pile of hay behind a photography studio, his lungs filling with blood, and died before the smoke had even cleared the street. He was the youngest victim of the West's most famous 30 seconds, a boy who died trying to play a man's deadliest game. 60. Ike Clanton, the coward's exit. Ike was the man who spent the night before the OK Corral, fueled by whiskey, threatening to tear the Earps apart. But the second the first hammer clicked in that tombstone alleyway, his bravado vanished. He famously ran, leaving his brother and friends to die in the dirt. He spent his remaining years as a ghost of his former self-pity cattle thief hiding in the brush. In 1887, his luck finally expired when a lawman named Jonas Brighton caught him rustling. Ike didn't turn to face him. He spurred his horse and tried to flee. Brighton was a better shot than the Earps. He put a rifle round through Ike's back, dumping him into the mud. It was a pathetic, silent end for the man who ignited the most famous feud in history. 59. Charlie Pierce, the partner's fate. Charlie was a loyal soldier in the Dew and Dalton gang, a man who believed in the code of the road when the rest of the world was turning to cold, hard cash. In 1895, he rode with his partner Bitter Creek Newcomb to a ranch in Oklahoma to visit a woman, unaware that the air was thick with betrayal. He was met not with a welcome, but with a barrage of shotgun fire from the woman's own brothers. They weren't lawmen, they were bounty hunters disguised as family. Pierce was cut down before he could even dismount. His body was tossed into a grain wagon and paraded into town like a piece of hunted game, the final indignity for a man who lived for a loyalty that no longer existed. 58. Bitter Creek Newcomb, the reward. Bitter Creek was a man looking for a way out. He rode to the home of his girlfriend, the famous Rose of Cimarron, hoping for a moment of peace and a chance to plan a life beyond the gun. But his head was worth $5,000, a fortune that proved thicker than blood. Her brothers, the B brothers, watched him from the shadows of the porch. As Newcomb stepped off his horse, they opened fire. He died in the dirt of the front yard, betrayed by the very people he hoped would help him disappear. In the end, he wasn't killed by the law. He was sold out by his own family. 57. Bill Dalton, the last brother. The final member of the infamous Dalton dynasty. By 1894, the Dalton name was a death sentence. A posse tracked Bill to a small, isolated house in Oklahoma, surrounding it in the dead of night. Realizing the walls were closing in, Bill jumped through a window, desperately sprinting for the cover of the brush. A deputy's bullet caught him mid-stride, killing him instantly. When the lawmen turned his body over, they found a deck of cards tucked into his vest pocket. He had bet his life on one last escape and finally drew the dead man's hand. 56. Emmett Dalton, the one who lived. Emmett was the miracle of the Coffeyville massacre. Despite being shot 23 times during the day of the two banks, he refused to die. After serving 14 years in prison, he walked out into a world he didn't recognize, a world of automobiles, telephones, and moving pictures. He moved to California and tried to become a quiet real estate agent, but his past followed him like a shadow. He spent his final years as a script consultant for Hollywood, watching silent film actors pretend to be the brothers he watched die in the mud. He died in a comfortable bed in 1937, a living relic of a dead era, outliving the frontier by nearly half a century. 55. Bob Dalton, the visionary's end. Bob Dalton was the leader whose ego was far deadlier than his aim. He wanted a legacy that would eclipse Jesse James, so he planned the impossible, robbing two banks at once in broad daylight in his own hometown. That ambition led his brothers into a slaughterhouse. The townspeople of Coffeyville didn't hide. They fought back with everything they had. Riddled with bullets and collapsing in a pile of stable hay, Bob's vision ended in a bloody mess. His last words weren't a curse or a defiant roar, but a desperate, broken plea. "Stop firing, for God's sake, I'm done." We're only 15 names in, and already a pattern is emerging. The West was a place of extreme violence, but it was also a place of extreme loneliness. I have to ask you, would you rather die a legend, celebrated in a blaze of glory you never actually had, or live long enough to watch your legend fade and be forgotten by a world that has no use for you anymore? Drop your legend status in the comments below. Do you want the myth, or do you want the truth? 54. Grat Dalton, the Coffeyville Massacre. The oldest and most hardened of the Dalton brothers. While Bob was dreaming of a name that would live forever, Grat was just trying to fight his way out of a death trap in Coffeyville. Cornered in an alleyway by the town marshal, Grat was shot through the throat while desperately trying to pull himself onto his horse. He didn't die in a high-stakes duel. He choked on his own blood, falling face down into the mud of the very town where he had grown up. It was the ultimate irony. The local boy who left to become a legend returned only to become a local tragedy, his body left on display for the neighbors he used to know. 53. Ned Christie, the Fortress. Ned Christie was a Cherokee statesman and a man of high honor, but a false accusation of killing a lawman turned his life into a war zone. He didn't flee, he retreated to a mountain fort. He built with his own hands, a house of double-layered logs with rifle ports. For years, he held the law at bay. In 1892, it finally took a small army of U.S. Marshals, a dynamite blast that shook the mountain, and a 3-pounder cannon to bring the walls down. Christie died defending his home until the very last second, a martyr to his people and a living nightmare to the men who spent years trying to break his spirit. 52. Jim Miller, Deacon Jim, the West's most clinical assassin. Miller was a man of eerie contradictions. He never smoked, never drank, and attended church every Sunday, all while charging $150 a head to kill up to 50 men. When a lynch mob finally broke into his jail in Ada, Oklahoma in 1909, Miller didn't beg for mercy. He remained the deacon until the end. He calmly asked for his hat, adjusted the noose around his own neck with steady hands, and shouted, "Let her rip," before leaping into the dark. He treated his own execution with the same cold, terrifying professionalism he gave his victims. Some of them died fast, some of them died forgotten, and some never really died at all. 51. Dave Rudabaugh, the Headless Bandit. Dirty Dave was a man so violent and unpredictable that he was the only person Billy the Kid truly feared. After a career defined by stagecoach robberies and daring jailbreaks, he fled south to Mexico, thinking his reputation would protect him. He was wrong. After he killed 2 men in a Betrayal saloon, the locals decided they had seen enough of the gringo outlaw. They ambushed him, decapitated him with a machete, and paraded his head through the streets on a pole. It was a brutal, blood-soaked reminder that north of the border legends meant absolutely nothing once you crossed the Rio Grande. 50. Tom O'Folliard, the first to fall. Billy the Kid's most loyal friend and a dedicated regulator. Tom was the first domino to fall in the final hunt led by Pat Garrett. In December 1880, during a midnight ambush at Fort Sumner, Garrett caught O'Folliard in his sights and put a bullet through his chest. Tom didn't die instantly. He lingered for 30 agonizing minutes in the freezing cold, begging the lawmen to just kill me and end the pain. He died in a dark, cramped room, his breath hitching in the silence, the first casualty of a legend that was about to be extinguished. 49. Chas Beaudry, the wrong door. A man caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. During the siege at Stinking Springs, Beaudry stepped out of a rock house to feed his horse. Garrett's posse, blinded by the morning sun and thinking he was the Kid, riddled him with bullets. He stumbled back inside, falling into Billy the Kid's arms. His last breath was a whisper of his wife's name, his blood soaking the floor of a hideout that had become a tomb. 48. Arkansas, Tom Jones, the last of the bunch. The only member of the Dalton gang captured at the Battle of Ingalls. He served 17 years in prison, walked out, and tried to be a restaurant cook. But the world of 1924 had no room for an old gunfighter. He returned to his old ways and was killed in a shootout with police in a dusty Missouri town. He was the literal last man standing of the 19th century outlaws, dying in an era of jazz and radio. 47. Rose of Cimarron, the survivor. Rose Dunn was the teenage lover of the Outlaws, the girl who reportedly ran through a hail of bullets to bring them ammunition. But she didn't die in a shootout. She married a local politician, became a grandmother, and lived until 1955. She spent decades watching the Wild West become a movie genre, a quiet woman in Oklahoma who took the real story of the Wild Bunch to her grave. 46. Bill Doolin, the family man's fall. The man who formed the Wild Bunch after the Daltons fell. Doolin tried to go straight for the sake of his wife and son, but the law wouldn't let him fade away. In 1896, while walking to his horse to flee into the night, he was ambushed by a posse led by Heck Thomas. He was hit by a blast of buckshot and died instantly under the Oklahoma stars, a man who tried to be a father but couldn't escape being an outlaw. 45. Zip Wyatt, the longest chase. Nathaniel Zip Wyatt was the most elusive man in the Oklahoma Territory. After a 200-mile chase that lasted days and a final shootout that lasted 6 hours, he was finally wounded and captured. He didn't die from the hanging he expected. He died in a jail cell in 1895 from the slow, agonizing rot of gangrene in his wounds. He spent his last days listening to the sound of his own end, a victim of the very land he tried to conquer. 44. Frank Kenton, the man with two names. Born Josiah Horner, he was a convicted outlaw who escaped prison and stole. The identity of Frank Kenton: he became a legendary U.S. Marshal and the lead enforcer for the cattle barons. He lived a long, controversial life and died of natural causes in 1927. He proved that in the West, if you were fast enough and cruel enough, you could bury your past under a tin star. 43. Johnny, behind the deuce. The lucky streak ends. John O'Rourke was a gambler who famously escaped a lynch mob in Tombstone when Wyatt Earp stood them down with a shotgun. But his luck didn't hold. He was found murdered in 1882 near a mining camp, likely over a gambling debt. The man who cheated a mob couldn't cheat the small, petty grudges that truly ran the West. 42. Scott Cooley, the blood feud ghost. A former Texas Ranger turned vigilante during the Mason County War. Cooley was a man possessed by vengeance, killing several men in a blood feud before simply vanishing from the face of the earth in 1876. Some say he was poisoned by a friend. Others say a brain fever took him. He left behind a trail of blood and no grave to mark where the violence finally stopped. 41. Jim Courtright, the long-haired duel. The marshal of Fort Worth who ran the Hell's Half-Acre District like a mob boss. He met his end in 1887 in a classic fast-draw duel against Luke Short. Courtright's gun snagged on his watch chain for a split second, the only mistake he ever made. Short put 3 bullets in him before Courtright could even clear leather. He died in the street he supposedly protected, killed by his own finery. We're halfway through, and the law is starting to look a lot like the Outlaws. Let's pick up the pace. The next 5 names? They didn't just die, they vanished, leaving behind nothing but empty graves and ghost stories. 40. Tom Blackjack Ketchum, the botched hanging, a train robber who met a gruesome end that literally made history. In 1901, the hangman in Clayton, New Mexico hadn't performed an execution in years. He miscalculated Ketchum's weight and used a rope that was far too long. When the trapdoor snapped open, the physics of the drop didn't just break his neck, it decapitated him. The crowd watched in horror as his head stayed in the noose and his body hit the ground. It was a dark, bloody exclamation point that signaled the violent end of the train robbing era. 39. Cherokee Bill, the Stoic. Crawford Goldsby, known as Cherokee Bill, was perhaps the most cold-blooded outlaw of the Indian Territory, rumored to have killed 13 people by age 20. At his hanging in 1896, the air was thick with tension. The crowd expected a breakdown or a confession. When the warden asked if he had any last words, Bill looked at the gallows with ice in his veins and said, "I came here to die, not to make a speech." He stepped onto the trapdoor with the same terrifying indifference he had shown his victims. 38. Soapy Smith, the con man's end. The undisputed king of frontier con men, Jefferson Soapy Smith, ran Skagway, Alaska like a private mafia fiefdom during the Klondike Gold Rush. He met his end on a cold pier in 1898 during a shootout with a vigilante group called the Committee of 101. Soapy died trying to protect a criminal empire built on lies, falling in a land where the law was finally catching up to the madness. He lived by the scam and died in the only moment of truth he couldn't manipulate. 37. Big Nose George Parrott, the Shoes. A petty train robber who became the victim of the West's most macabre trophy hunting. After he was lynched by a mob in 1881, a local doctor named John Osborne took the body for medical research. Instead, he skinned Parrott's thighs and chest to make a pair of custom leather shoes. Osborne later wore those very shoes to his inauguration as the governor of Wyoming. To this day, the Parrott shoes sit in a museum a man turned into footwear for the sake of a politician's vanity. We are entering the darkest chapter of the West, where the law was often more twisted than the outlaws. 36. Texas, Jack Omohundro, the Fever. The first true cowboy star of the stage and the man who taught Buffalo Bill how to act. While his peers were dying from lead, Jack died from the invisible killer of the frontier, disease. In 1880, at just 33 years old, he succumbed to pneumonia in a freezing mining camp in Leadville, Colorado. He was a man of the spotlight who died in the wings, his final performance witnessed only by the cold mountain air. We've seen the legends fall to bullets, but as we move toward the top names, the killers are getting stranger. Fever, accidents, and even their own fame are starting to take them out. I have to ask you, if you were trapped in the 1880s, which fate would you fear more? A quick, violent end in a dusty street where everyone knows your name. A slow, quiet disappearance into a world that's forgotten you. Type street or silence in the comments. Let's see how many of you would actually choose the legend over life. 35. Commodore Perry Owens, the Quiet Retirement. The long-haired sheriff of Apache County was a living legend after the Holbrook shootout, where he single-handedly killed 3 men with a Winchester while holding a box of horse feed. He retired to open a quiet general store, but the mind that once tracked killers through the desert began to fail. He died in 1919 of Alzheimer's disease, his memories of the gunfights and the open range fading into a fog before he finally found the peace that the frontier never allowed him. 34. Mysterious Dave Mather, The Vanishing Act. A man who was a lawman in Dodge City and an outlaw everywhere else, often on the same day. After a high-stakes shootout in 1885, Mather didn't wait for a trial, he simply walked out of town and vanished. No death certificate exists. No grave was ever found. Legend says he fled to Canada and joined the Mounties under a fake name. He chose to become a ghost, leaving historians to wonder if he died a hero, a villain, or something entirely different. 33. Kingfisher, the Ambush Buddy. A flamboyant dresser who wore chaps made of jaguar skin and once famously said he only killed white men because they were more of a challenge. In 1884, he walked into a San Antonio theater with his friend Ben Thompson, expecting a night of entertainment. Instead, they were lured into a kill zone. Ambushed from a darkened balcony, Fisher died in a tuxedo, his fine clothes soaked in red. A final bloody fashion statement for the man who lived for the spectacle. 32. Luke Short, the king of gamblers. The man who won the Dodge City War without firing a single shot, using only his wits and his connections. Short was a master of the bluff, a man who survived the deadliest gunfights of the era. But he couldn't bluff the sickness in his chest. He died in 1893 of congestive heart failure at age 39. The man who survived a dozen duels was ultimately taken down by the very heart that had never failed him in a fight. 31. Ben Thompson, the theater trap. A world-class gunfighter and a man so dangerous that even Wyatt Earp once hesitated to face him. Thompson was lured to the vaudeville theater in San Antonio under the guise of a peace meeting to end a long-standing bloody grudge. It was a cold-blooded setup. As he and King Fisher sat in the balcony, a hail of lead poured down from a hidden kill box behind the curtains. Thompson was hit 9 times before he could even clear leather. He died in the theater aisles, a predatory end for a man who had spent his life as the frontier's most efficient killer, now turned into the prey. 30. Sam Bass, the birthday death. The Texas outlaw was a simple man who loved fast horses and easy money, but he was ultimately betrayed by one of his own inner circle, Jim Murphy, who traded Sam's life for his own father's freedom. On his 27th birthday, in 1878, Bass was ambushed during a scouting mission in Round Rock. Riddled with rifle fire, he managed to stay in the saddle for miles before collapsing. He lingered for 2 agonizing days, refusing to name his partners, whispering his final haunting words, "The world is bobbing around me." He was a young man whose legend was just beginning to catch fire when the law finally extinguished it. 29. Johnny Ringo, the Lone Tree. The most educated, most depressed, and arguably the most mysterious figure in the cowboy faction. In 1882, the king of the cowboys was found dead in Turkey Creek Canyon, leaning against a low-hanging oak tree with a single bullet hole in his temple. He was found in his undershirt, his boots tied to his saddle, a sign of a man who had either lost his mind to whiskey or been caught in a bizarre struggle. Whether it was a suicide brought on by the crushing weight of isolation or a silent, long-distance hit by a vengeful Wyatt Earp, the truth remains buried in the scorched silence of the Arizona desert. 28. Cole Younger, the Penitent. A man whose name was once synonymous with the terror of the James Younger gang. After spending 20 years in a Minnesota prison for the bloodbath at Northfield, the terrible Cole Younger emerged as a man of deep vocal faith. He spent his final years as a traveling preacher and a Wild West show performer, standing before crowds not to brag about his crimes, but to warn that the outlaw life was a hollow lie built on the blood of others. He died peacefully in 1916 with a Bible in his hand, having spent the second half of his life trying to outrun the ghost of the man he was in the first. 27. Frank James, the ticket taker. The elder James brother was the strategic mind behind the gang's most successful raids. Following Jesse's death, Frank surrendered in 1882 and, through a series of legal miracles, was never convicted of his crimes. He spent his final decades in the most mundane, civilized ways imaginable, working as a shoe salesman and a ticket taker at a theater, where curious tourists paid a nickel just to stare into the eyes of a man who once held up whole towns. He died in 1915 on the family farm, a quiet, domestic end for a man who had survived a decade of guerrilla warfare and high-stakes banditry. 26. Bill Tilghman, the Old Lion. The legendary lawman who survived the worst days of Dodge City and the lawless Oklahoma territories. In 1924, at the age of 70, Tilghman refused to retire, still wearing a badge in the corrupt oil town of Cromwell. He was murdered by a crooked prohibition agent named Wiley Lynn, who was high on seized narcotics. Tilghman, governed by a rigid code of professional honor, refused to draw his gun on a fellow officer, even a corrupt one. He died in the street with his badge still pinned to his chest, the last of the great 3 marshals to fall. 25. El Fuego Baca, the survivor. Famous for the legendary Frisco shootout, where as a 19-year-old deputy he survived a 33-hour standoff against 80 vengeful cowboys. The gunman fired over 4,000 rounds into his thin-walled wooden shack. When the smoke cleared, Baca walked out without a single scratch, having reportedly been protected by a statue of a saint. He lived to be 80 years old, dying peacefully in 1945 after a career as a lawyer, sheriff, and politician. He was the rare frontier legend who didn't just survive the violence, he outlived it until it became history. 24. Clay Allison, the drunkard's accident. The shootist who was so dangerous that even the most famous lawmen gave him a wide berth. Allison famously claimed he never killed a man that didn't need killing, but his greatest enemy was the bottle. In 1887, while heavily intoxicated, he fell from his freight wagon during a routine supply run. The heavy, iron-rimmed rear wheel ran directly over his neck, snapping it instantly and killing him on the spot. A man who had survived dozens of high-stakes duels and outdrawn some of the deadliest men in Texas was finally taken down by a simple wagon wheel and his own thirst. 23. John Henry Klum, the editor. The man who achieved the impossible. He captured the Apache leader Geronimo without firing a single shot and went on to found the Tombstone Epitaph. Klum lived to be 80, eventually dying in Los Angeles in 1932. He spent his final decades as a traveling lecturer and historian, meticulously shaping the narrative of the Old West. He made sure the world remembered the Earps and the Outlaws exactly as he saw them, polishing the rough, bloody edges of frontier reality into the shiny, heroic Hollywood myth we recognize today. 22. James Butler Hickok, the first Wild Bill. The cousin and close contemporary of the legendary Wild Bill Hickok. He lived a life of scouts, danger, and frontier grit. But unlike his famous cousin, he possessed the wisdom to walk away from the gunsmoke before it claimed him. He died quietly in his bed in Illinois, thousands of miles from the lawless Black Hills. He was a man who shared a name and a past with a legend, but chose a quiet, unremarkable future that didn't involve a bullet in the back of the head. 21. Kit Carson, the broken artery. A trapper, scout, and general whose life served as the literal blueprint for the American Western hero. Carson survived decades of mountain lion attacks, tribal wars, and grueling winters, but his end was surprisingly domestic. He died in 1868 in Colorado while sitting in his quarters. While eating buffalo meat and smoking his favorite pipe, a large aneurysm in his stomach burst. He was gone in a matter of minutes. His final words were a simple, gritty goodbye to the men he had led through the wilderness. Adios, compadres. 20. Geronimo, the prisoner of war. The legendary Apache leader who once commanded the fear of two nations spent his final decades as a living trophy. Held as a prisoner of war at Fort Sill, he was reduced to a circus attraction, forced to appear at World's Fairs where he sold the very buttons off his coat to tourists for a few cents. The man who had eluded thousands of U.S. troops for years was now trapped in a civilization that treated him like a museum exhibit. In February 1909, the end came not in battle but in a ditch. After a night of heavy drinking in Lawton, Oklahoma, the aging warrior fell from his horse while riding home. He was too weak to climb out, lying in the damp, freezing mud for the entire night. By the time he was found the next morning, pneumonia had already taken hold of his lungs. He died shortly after in the hospital, his final words heavy with the crushing weight of regret. "I should never have surrendered. I should have fought until I was the last man living." The names are getting bigger now, the legends you think you know, but their endings, not even close to what you were told. Stay with us for the top 10 names that define the West and the concrete, skyscrapers, and betrayal that killed them. 19. Seth Bullock, the Pillar of Deadwood. The man who brought a thin line of order to the most lawless camp in America. Bullock didn't need to kill to be feared. His steely-eyed stare was reportedly enough to back down the most hardened miners. He became such a symbol of the civilized West that he struck up a lifelong friendship with Teddy Roosevelt, even leading a troop of cowboys in the inaugural parade. Bullock died of cancer in 1919 in the very hotel he built to tame Deadwood. He is buried on a steep, grueling hill overlooking the town, positioned so his spirit can watch over the valley for eternity, still on duty long after the gold ran out. Pearl Hart, the Lady Bandit's exit. Pearl was a media sensation who proved that the frontier wasn't just a man's world. In 1899, she pulled off the last recorded stagecoach robbery in Arizona, cutting her hair short and wielding a .38 revolver. After a sensational stint in Yuma Territorial Prison, where she was the only female inmate, she chose a path most outlaws couldn't. She disappeared. Rumors persisted for decades that the Lady Bandit lived as a quiet, church-going grandmother in the 1950s. She died in 1955, a silent relic of the highwaymen hiding in plain sight within the white picket fence suburbs of the atomic age. 17. Tom Horn, The Last Rope, a dinosaur watching the meteor fall. Horn was a legendary scout in Pinkerton who became a stock detective, a polite term for a hired killer for the cattle barons. In 1903, he was hanged for the murder of a 14-year-old boy, a crime many historians believe he was framed for by a Wyoming government, desperate to shed its violent image. Horn showed no fear at the end. He calmly stood on the gallows and helped the hangman adjust the noose. He was the last of his kind, a man whose useful violence had become an embarrassment to the new, polite society he helped build. 16. Bass Reeves, the Indomitable, the real-life inspiration for the Lone Ranger and perhaps the greatest lawman in American history. Born into slavery, Reeves escaped to the Indian Territory and eventually became a U.S. Deputy Marshal. Over 35 years, he arrested over 3,000 outlaws and killed 14 in self-defense, famously never being wounded himself despite having his hat and belt shot off. He survived the gunmen and the systemic racism of the era, but he couldn't arrest the sickness in his own blood. He died of kidney disease in 1910, a man of staggering dignity who proved the star belonged to the man, not the color of his skin. 15. Black Bart, the Disappearing Poet. Charles Bolus was the gentleman bandit who robbed 28 stagecoaches without ever firing a shot, famously leaving handwritten poems in the empty strongboxes to taunt the law. After serving time in San Quentin, he walked out of the prison gates in 1888 and simply dissolved into a thick San Francisco fog. No death certificate was ever filed and no grave bears his name. He chose to vanish entirely, proving that the most effective way to keep a legend alive is to never let the world see the end of the story. 14. John Wesley Hardin, The Mirror's Gaze. Hardin was a sociopath who claimed to have killed 42 men, once famously shooting a man in the next hotel room just for snoring too loud. In 1895, the law finally caught him in an El Paso saloon. While he was rolling dice at the bar, an old rival named John Selman stepped in behind him, and Hardin never got the chance to turn. Hardin died staring at his own reflection in the bar mirror. The last face he ever saw was the one that had terrorized the state of Texas for 3 decades. 13. Pat Garrett, The Lonely Road. The man who shot Billy the Kid didn't die a celebrated hero. He died a bitter pariah, hated by those who loved the kid and ignored by the government he once served. For 27 years, Garrett lived in the shadow of the boy he had killed a man out of time, broke and drowning in debt, while the world moved on toward a more civilized century. In 1908, while stopped on a desolate New Mexico road to urinate, Garrett never saw it coming. The danger wasn't in front of him. He never saw the muzzle flash, and he never had a chance to reach for his gun. The man who had spent his life hunting the West's most famous outlaw met an end just as violent and twice as lonely, dying with far less public sympathy than the kid himself. In the end, the frontier had no more use for the lawman who had helped tame it, leaving him to bleed out in the desert dust. 12. Calamity Jane, The Drunken Mourner. Martha Jane Canary lived a life built on exaggerated tall tales and a devastating addiction to hard whiskey. She died in 1903 in a cramped rented room in South Dakota, ravaged by alcoholism and pneumonia at only 51. Her final dying wish was to be buried next to Wild Bill Hickok. The town of Deadwood granted the request not out of respect for Jane, but as a final cruel joke by the locals, who knew that in life Bill Hickok had no use for her and would have been horrified by the arrangement. 11. Wild Bill Hickok, The Dead Man's Hand. Deadwood, 1876. The Prince of Pistoliers was a man of high stakes and higher paranoia, but on one sweltering afternoon he broke his own golden rule. He sat with his back to the door during a poker game in Nuttall and Mann's saloon. Jack McCall, a local drunk seeking a hollow kind of fame, walked in and put a .45 caliber hole in the back of Bill's head. Hickok didn't even have time to reach for his ivory-handled revolvers. He slumped over the table holding a pair of aces and a pair of eights, the dead man's hand. The ultimate gambler finally ran out of luck in the very mud-slick camp that had birthed his legend. 10. Belle Starr, the Queen's Backstab. The bandit queen of the Cook gang was a figure of frontier fashion, riding in velvet with a six-shooter on her hip. But in 1889, her story ended not in a heist, but in a ditch. She was blasted off her horse by a double-barrel shotgun while riding home in Oklahoma. The killer was never officially caught, but the lead suspects were the men she shared her dinner table with, her own husband and her son. She died face down in the mud, her silk finery soaked in red by a betrayal that came for her own blood. 9. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, the Bolivian mystery. Did they die in a desperate final hail of bullets in San Vicente, Bolivia in 1908? Or did they slip away, returning to the American Northwest to live out their days as quiet ghosts? While the official story claims a double suicide pact to avoid a firing squad, the complete lack of DNA evidence and persistent family whispers mean the desert keeps its secrets. They remain the West's eternal fugitives, refusing to be pinned down by history or a grave. 8. Jesse James, the traitor's bullet. Living under the alias Mr. Howard in a quiet Missouri home, Jesse James thought he had finally bought peace. On a spring morning in 1882, he committed the fatal error of trusting his inner circle. He stepped onto a chair to straighten a dusty picture on his wall, turning his back on Bob Ford. Ford, a member of his own gang who had sold Jesse's life for a governor's pardon, drew his pistol and fired. The king of outlaws was killed for reward money by a dirty little coward who was too terrified to face him when his hands were free. 7. Davy Crockett, the Surrender. The Hollywood myth says he died swinging his empty rifle, Old Betsy, atop the walls of the Alamo. The reality is far grittier. Records from Mexican military diaries suggest Crockett was one of a handful of survivors who surrendered as the fort fell. He didn't die in a blaze of glory. He was executed by sword under the personal, cold-blooded orders of General Santa Anna. He died as a prisoner of war, his legend beginning the exact moment the steel touched his throat. 6. Billy the Kid, the Shadow in the Dark. He was the most famous 21-year-old on the planet, a boy whose smile was as quick as his draw. In July 1881, the law finally cornered him in a pitch-black bedroom at the Maxwell Ranch in Fort Sumner. The kid stepped into the room barefoot, carrying a butcher knife and a revolver, sensing a presence he couldn't see. He whispered into the heavy silence, "Who is it?" But the only answer he received was the roar of Pat Garrett's Winchester. The first bullet tore through the kid's heart, and he fell into the shadows before he could even raise his weapon. But the end of the man was only the beginning of the ghost. Whether he truly bled out on that dirt floor, or, as legend suggests, escaped to the Texas scrub to live out his days as Brushy Bill Roberts, remains the frontier's greatest what-if. Billy remains frozen in time, a perpetual boyish outlaw in a world that was rapidly being fenced in, paved over, and stripped of its mystery. He didn't just die, he became the eternal symbol of a West that refused to be tamed. These aren't just deaths anymore. These are the moments where myth completely breaks. 5. Annie Oakley, the Quiet Aim. Little Sure Shot survived the rough-and-tumble world of the Wild West shows, but she couldn't outshoot time. She died of pernicious anemia in 1926 at the age of 66. Her husband of 50 years, Frank Butler, was so devastated by the loss of his partner that he simply stopped eating. He followed her into the dark just 18 days later. Annie never missed a target in her professional life, and in the end, death was the only thing in the world she couldn't hit. 4. Doc Holliday, the Unexpected Bed. The most dangerous dentist in the West lived every day expecting to die in a street fight with his boots on. Instead, in 1887, he found himself in a hotel room in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, fading from the consumption that had chased him for years. He looked at his bare feet on the sheets, the feet of a man who was dying in a bed, and whispered, "This is funny." He took his last breath with his boots off, losing the final gamble of his life to a slow-burning sickness rather than a fast-moving bullet. 3. Wyatt Earp, the Ghost of Hollywood. The invincible lawman of Tombstone outlived nearly everyone he ever fought and nearly everyone he ever loved. He died at 80 years old in a small Los Angeles bungalow in 1929. Just as the silent film era was ending, he spent his final years as a consultant for early westerns, watching actors turn his blood-soaked reality into a clean, profitable myth. He outlived the frontier only to see it become a cartoon, dying while trying to convince Hollywood that his life was more than just a script. 2. Bat Masterson, the gunslinger with a pen. The deadly lawman and scout of Dodge City performed the ultimate reinvention, ending his days in the concrete jungle of New York City in 1921. Masterson was working as a sports writer for the Morning Telegraph, trading his six-shooter for a typewriter. He was in the middle of typing a column when his heart finally gave out. A man who had survived a dozen high-noon shootouts was finally taken down by the stress, the noise, and the exhaustion of a city deadline. We've seen them die in the mud, in the dark, and in the gears of a world that no longer wanted them. But the final name on our list didn't just survive the frontier. He sold it to the world as a lie, only to be entombed in the very thing that killed the West, 20 tons of cold, gray concrete. 1. Buffalo Bill Cody, the man buried in concrete. The face of the American West died of kidney failure in 1917, a showman who had outlived his own era. But his death sparked one final bizarre frontier war. The town he founded in Wyoming claimed his body belonged to them, threatening to kidnap the corpse from Denver by force. To stop the heist, Denver authorities hauled his casket to the summit of Lookout Mountain, blasted a hole into the solid rock, and poured 20 tons of wet concrete directly over him. The man who spent his entire life selling the myth of infinite freedom ended his story trapped under a mountain of man-made stone. It was the final, heavy irony of the frontier. The wild was officially dead, and its greatest legend was paved over for good. The final legend on our list isn't a person, it's the West itself. The Wild West didn't die with a bang. It died with the click of a padlock. It died when the first strand of barbed wire was stretched across the open range, slicing the horizon in two. It died when the railroads replaced the stagecoaches, and when the law became a business rather than a personal code. By 1920, the men who had survived the gunfights were living in a world they didn't recognize. There were cars on the streets of Tombstone. There were telephones in Dodge City. The wild had been bled out of the land, replaced by sidewalks and tax codes. The West didn't run out of heroes. It built a world where heroes had nowhere left to stand, and one by one they disappeared into it.